All right, so good to see everybody. Before we start working through some new workbook problems in today's meeting, I wanted to go back to the movie theater problem. So I actually did give it a little bit more thought after our discussion on Tuesday and realized that maybe there is a better way of modeling this problem. And I played around with it a little bit, and I think I have come up with a better way of making sure that we enforce some of the rules that are discussed in the workbook. Very specifically, the rule that a specific movie can only be shown in one theater at a cinema at a time. I kept on thinking about this, and even when I was saying it out loud, I was thinking, I really wonder if there is a way to enforce this by modeling it slightly differently, but I didn't want to necessarily try to suss that out in the class with you guys. I wanted to do it kind of offline. So I did, and here's what I came up with. You can see that for the most part, a lot of the things are very similar to what we came up with together, where we still have a cinema entity which has a unique identifier, cinema ID. Each cinema has one or more theaters, which has a theater ID and something to do with some capacity in terms of how many people can sit in that theater. We store a variety of different movies, which of course have unique identifiers and all sorts of other information about them. And then the one part that I thought was a little troubling, we were trying to model in class, is what's being shown in what particular theater. And the way we had done this before is by creating an associative entity between movies and theaters and adding an additional time slot or date time slot component to the unique identifier for that associative entity that would control that at a particular time slot, a particular movie has to be shown in a particular theater. But what it didn't necessarily control for is that a different theater at the exact same time slot isn't supposed to show the same movie. So what I did is I created an associative entity with a slightly different set of unique identifiers in a relationship not between theater and movie, but between cinema and movie. That's the primary relationship of this associative entity for movies that are being shown. So I specifically wrote down the three attributes that are the unique identifiers for this associative entity. There's another one, which is the theater ID, and it would be part of this table, and the theater ID has a relationship with the theater table, but it is not a unique identifier for the shows table. It's absolutely possible that the same theater could show up a bunch of different times. It's totally okay. What's unique is in a particular cinema, which might have 18 theaters, at a particular time slot, you're only going to see one movie one time. And that is exactly what the problem describes, is in a particular cinema, if I'm trying to show the latest Die Hard movie at 11 a.m., it can only show in that theater, in that cinema, in one of the theaters. So by making the cinema ID and the time slot and the movie ID as a combination unique at 11 a.m. in the theater in College Station, the movie Die Hard can be shown. And it's going to be shown in the theater, 1 or 2 or 7 or 12, but it can only be shown in that cinema in one place for that one time. We're enforcing the business rule correctly. And then I would look up the theater, and I do have that relationship there where when I go from shows to theater, it has to have exactly one theater and no more than one theater. Theaters may or may not participate in shows. Cinemas may or may not participate in shows. Movies may or may not participate in shows, right? So all of those are optional many's going into the associative entity, and all of them are mandatory ones going out of the associative entity. But this link right here is not a link for a primary key to foreign key. It's a link between just a field in the shows table and the primary key in the theaters table. It doesn't necessarily have to be unique over here. You might see the same theater show up a bunch of different times, totally okay. So just a slight rearrangement of what we did in class, but this actually more accurately reflects some of the rules that were described in that problem, and I wanted to come back and revisit it. And this brings up a really good point. I am far from infallible in all of my classes, but in particular in this one when we're modeling problems. And some of these problems, even if I've seen them before, this one we did last spring, but I have blind spots, and I even mentioned my blind spot in class on Tuesday, which was, I think cinema's kind of silly. I'd have a unique identifier for every theater across the country and kind of not worry about cinema. Well, by thinking like that, I missed a key component, which is the cinema is critical to enforcing a business rule, which is in a given cinema, a movie can only be shown once per time slot in a unique theater. And in a different time slot, it can be shown again in a different theater, but once per cinema per time slot. So by having that blind spot, I kind of messed up the modeling a little bit. And it's possible that some of you as groups had this model a little bit better than what I did on Tuesday. If you did great. If you didn't, if you had it more like what we came up with, that's also fine, but you can see that this works just a little bit better. Okay. All right, so for today, we are going to keep working through our modeling examples. I'm going to have you guys start with problem 10, where we're modeling the local garage. As we've done before, I'm going to have you break out into separate groups. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms here and give you guys a couple minutes to talk about it, and then we'll get back together and discuss.
Professor, quick question. So with the associative entity, you can have, is there like a number that you can't exceed for things that associate?
No, not really. Usually we think
Okay.
about it as usually 2 or 3, because we think about kind of a many-to-many relationship that we're trying to model. But if it ties into more entities and that's the right way to get everything to fit, that's totally okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, I'm opening up the rooms and I'll see you guys back in here in around 10 minutes. Thanks. All right, let's go ahead and talk about problem number 10. And it looks like Absar Ali, you are up. So if you'll have your group artist share their screen with us, then you can go ahead and explain this problem to us.
All right. Is it working? Can y'all see?
Yep.
Okay. So we started off with the customer, and it says the customer can have more than one car. So that's the relationship right here. They can have, and we said it should be a mandatory many, because if you don't have a car, then how are you gonna be at the local garage as a customer? So that's that. And for the primary keys, we use the count number for the customer and the VIN on the car for the car itself. Going on that way, we made an associative entity here because of the many-to-many relationship between automobile and parts, and then the work that needs to be done between the two. And so what we said is that it has to be a mandatory many on the work side of it, because that the car needs to be done, it needs to have work done, otherwise it wouldn't be at the shop. But it could have an optional amount of parts, or it could just need a little fixing that probably doesn't require parts or anything like that.
Okay. Let's leave the screen up. Anybody else want to comment on this or have any other ways that they would model this or anything they want to contribute?
Something that we talked about in my group and that really made sense once he went over his is that you could bring up, what if the person sells the car and then someone else buys that car and brings it into the same shop? Would you need to have a combination of customer ID and VIN number to create a relationship?
Right. So in that case, you would have to add probably another customer that belongs to that same car. You'd have to change it, and you'd probably remove the original customer from the connection with that car, or kind of archive that customer's information because they no longer have that car. That's an interesting challenge, right? Because that does happen where products shift from one customer to another. So that might be an argument for not using VIN number for the automobile ID, because you could have my 2011 Ford Explorer belonging to me with a unique automobile ID number in the database. And then if I sell it to somebody else and they bring it in for service, well, it's the exact same car with the exact same VIN number, but I give it another unique automobile ID in my database so that I treat it basically like a brand new vehicle that's owned by a new customer. So again,
Like
maybe an argument why you wouldn't use VIN number, you wouldn't use social security number, you would use something that you create in your database so that you have a little bit of additional flexibility. So good point. Anybody else?
Did you add customer to the associative entity for work and have a three-way tie?
I'm not sure you need to do that. The work is being done on the automobile, and the automobile is owned by exactly one customer. So I don't know what the relationship between the customer and the work would be directly.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you can track back, right? So from the work, you'd go back to a car, and from the car, you'd go back to the specific customer that owns that car. So you'd still get that relationship. There's no reason to remove the automobile from the link. Other comments or questions from anybody else?
So one thing that my group did was, so we had parts and then the cost of each part, but under work, we had total charge, and then an offshoot of total charge, we had labor charge and parts cost.
All right, so
So-
let's have your group share their screen. I want to talk about this total cost. That's a good point. So whoever's in James's group, great. So there's a labor cost involved. Would I want to store part cost in the repair work table?
I guess it doesn't make sense to our reasoning though, is it would be nice to be able to have a total cost right there, but I guess that's, now that I think about it, that's something that you could use the database to calculate.
Bingo. It would be absolutely beautiful to have. And in fact, we would generate a report. What you see as a customer when they print out an invoice and hand it to you is not how the invoice or the repair work is stored in the database. In the database, how it is stored is the unique car ID and the parts and the quantity of parts that we used. And the unique car ID and the parts and the number of parts we used. And the unique car ID and the parts we used. And probably for each of those, a labor cost, which might be zero for a bunch of them, and then $50 at the end, or might be the amount of labor for each one of those repairs. I don't know. That's how it's stored in the database. What we would do as a report is we generate, hey, you had these repairs done, and these are all the parts that went in, and here's the subtotal for each of those parts times the quantity. And here's then the total amount you spent on parts. Here's the total amount you spent on labor. Here's the total bill plus taxes. Here's everything you owe us minus your 10% coupon, right? Like all that stuff gets put into a report, but it wouldn't necessarily be stored in the table in the database. So I love that you guys were thinking about labor cost and part cost being part of total cost. Labor cost has to be stored someplace. It's stored in the repair work done because it's how long the person had to work on your car. Part cost gets stored in parts because it never changes. If you read the description, it's always tied to the part itself and it never changes. And then we would calculate on the fly whenever we need it to show to somebody, even to ourselves on the screen, things like subtotals and totals and taxes and all that sort of thing.
So what happens if the part price changes?
If the part price changes, you would change it for that part in the parts table, and then it would change for all future work that's being done.
But would it already be archived? Like if I got, my car fixed a year ago, and with that work done, would it still be archived as what the previous cost
Right,
was?
so that's a good question. So what we would probably have to do is, again, have some archival storage of this repair now is done, it's finished. And so we lock it as this was the amount for this thing and we collected money from them, we're done with it. If the parts change moving forward, we wouldn't let it fix any of our historical data. But there is a difference, and this is, we'll get into this a little later in the semester, a difference between a transactional database, which is basically live data that we're manipulating, and data that is older than that, that we can go look it up, but it's archival, and we're just using it for looking up resources from before. So if it was within, and this happens, you guys have dealt with companies that do this. If it's within 30 days and the part changes, they might send you a refund and say, you know what, this part price went down, so we owe you $5 and here it is. Or we'll give you $5 on your next repair because there has been a shift in pricing. Some companies do actually honor those price changes. That would be part of the transactional database seeing a change, which would be reflected in the repair work. And we would have to somehow reconcile that versus old stuff that happened a long time ago. Well, it's too bad. That part is different now and you're not going to see any changes in the pricing. Great question, John. Anybody else on this problem? Good work. Thank you, guys. All right, let's do one more breakout and have you guys tackle problem. Well, you know what? Let's skip problem 11. I think problem 11 is actually pretty easy. It does have some extraneous information in there about things like what we're going to do at the beginning of the semester, what we're going to do on the third week of the semester, what we're going to do at the end of the semester. But if you take out that timing, the modeling of problem 11 is pretty easy. So I'm going to let you guys work on that one on your own. I don't think that one's particularly difficult. So let's move on to problem 12, because 12, while not necessarily being difficult, is a little bit more involved. So I'm going to send you guys back out in the breakout rooms and give you a little bit more time to work on problem 12, and then we'll get back together and talk about it again. All right, see you guys in a few minutes. All right. This one is, it looks easy at first, and then you start to work on it, and then it's not so easy. It's a little sneaky. Let's see how we did. And I'm gonna ask for Christopher De Leon to contribute right now. So if you'll have your group share your diagram, let's go ahead and talk about what you got. Christopher, are you here? You were here earlier.
I
Christopher,
will step in for Christopher and say that sometimes he has a
hello.
hard time coming back from breakout rooms.
yeah, for some reason, the transition to and from breakout rooms for Christopher is challenging. Christopher, you are up. You're going to present this one. So have your group share your screen and let's talk about it.
All right, sorry, my thing literally takes like 30 seconds to transition.
I've noticed. At first, I thought it was you. It's obviously something technical, so that's fine.
Yes, sir. Okay, so we first start off with the customer, and we first were trying to figure out who did the referral, so we did the referral back to the customer, even though there can be multiple ones through. And that's why we put an optional many, and then from customer to job, we said that a customer could definitely have many jobs, but a job can only have one customer. And then we put and what kind of got us tripped up a little bit was about the employees, because we're a little confused about how to do if the customer had an issue with an employee. And so we put it to where that an employee could have multiple roles in the company. Like one day they could be a painter, or one day they could be a foreman. And so we connected our employee to our employee role, and we connected the job and employee role. So on this job, when you're looking for that job, you can find what employee or what that role is, because we're in case an employee had a different role on a different job. So you need to know the job number to find that out.
Okay, we're going to come back to this diagram, but there are a couple things that concern me before we look at somebody else's. And probably the first one I'm going to mention is, again, if I understand this correctly, is this little guy right here. Because I understand the referral is that a customer could refer nobody or could refer a whole bunch of people. But going the other direction, a customer is referred by exactly one person. I might not get referred. I might have looked you up on Google and found you, so I might not have a referral. So I think that should be an optional menu, optional 01.
Okay.
Right. You may not have a referral, but if you do, you were referred by one person. She does say she's not interested in multiple referrals.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
That makes sense.
We'll come back to this one. It's not quite right. I can see why you guys got tripped up, where you got tripped up. So we'll definitely come back to it here in a little bit. But let's ask somebody else to share their group's work. And I didn't verify this. Yeah, it looks like they're in a different group. Trevor Doak, let's go ahead and see what your group came up with.
Yeah, Upsar. Maybe.
Absar, if you're there, we need to see the diagram.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there we go. Awesome. So we definitely did not have as many lines coming off ours as they did, but we kind of kept it simple because we were a little bit confused. But so for customers and referrals, I kind of agree with, like, I definitely agree with what you said, that the customers like can have many referrals but don't have to be referred. But you said that it had to be a one or optional the other way. So that part we can fix. But for the customers to jobs, we said that customers can require many jobs, but they don't have to have any jobs. And then employees have to work on at least one job, but don't have to, but can work on many. And then we had employee ID coming off of employee for the primary key and job number for the jobs, but we were trying to find a way to combine the specific job to the specific employee. And we were thinking about putting another associative entity off of that associative entity, and we weren't sure if we could even do that. So is that possible?
You can do that. You probably
Okay.
don't want to do that in this particular problem.
Okay.
But
Yeah, we
there's
didn't
no,
even know
there's no
what we'd
rule
call
that
it.
says an associative entity can't be associated with another associative entity. It's just you're probably making things overcomplicated.
Okay. Yeah. Other than that, I mean, we have like the name, the salary of the employee, position of the employee, which would include both positions.
Okay.
Um,
So again, similar in some ways,
Mhm.
but still people are getting a little tripped up about how do you handle these various roles from employees for these various jobs. Yeah. Does any other group want to chime in? Do they have a particularly different solution to this that they want to share? Or is everybody kind of tripped up? Because I'll be happy to share mine, but if somebody else feels like they've got it, now's your chance to step up and be a superstar.
We would be happy if you shared yours.
You want to see mine?
Yes.
Flatter me. Okay. Let me see what I can do. Share my screen. I think you're going to be frustrated in that there aren't that many entities. But let's talk about how this works. And I just did this while you guys were doing it. So it is entirely possible that I missed something. So if I did, don't be nervous about shouting it out. If I got something wrong, I want to know, but I think I got this right. Here's how this is going to work. Employees, well, let's do customers first. The referral thing I think we've got, which is that a customer could potentially refer nobody, but they could potentially refer a bunch of people. My wife absolutely loves a particular shoe brand, and I think she has referred a dozen people to her favorite shoes. So she would be in there a bunch of times as a referral, right? But on the other direction, if you have a referral, you have a referral from exactly one person. And what that would look like, actually, if I share a different screen real quick, is something like this. There'd be more information in the table, but a customer would have a unique customer ID, and we'd have their name and their phone number and all that stuff. And then we'd have another column, which is referred by. And the information that's in here has to be a customer ID. It has to be one of the customers that we already have. And it can only be one, right? So in this case, you can see that customer 3 referred 3 different people. They referred customer 1, and they referred customer 4, and they referred customer 7. Some customers don't have any referrals, in which case they're blank. But if you have a referral, you have exactly one referral, and it has to be somebody else that already pre-exists in the system. That's it. Okay. So from a data standpoint, that's kind of what we were talking about. Now, let's go back to the model. And let's tackle the jobs. There are 2 things that are happening in jobs from a modeling standpoint. One is that every job has to have exactly one foreman. In order to have one foreman, I basically have a relationship that says that a job has to have one of the employees assigned as a foreman, and only one employee assigned as a foreman. Can an employee be a foreman on multiple jobs? Absolutely. So it's an optional many. They might be a foreman for a bunch of jobs. They might be a foreman for no jobs. They might never be in charge. But in the other direction, the job table is going to have a column that says foreman, and it's going to have an employee ID in there. And it's going to be one employee ID. Just like in the customer table, there's a column that says referral, and it's going to have a customer ID in there for who referred them. But the difference is, in this case, it's mandatory. It will absolutely be filled in by exactly one employee, and that is the foreman on that job. So that's one thing. So that'd be stored in the job table, and it would be a rule that's enforced in the database that says you got to look up that information over in the employees table, and it has to match up with a unique identifier over there, and it has to be stored in the job table. You absolutely have to have a foreman. Okay, so it's just a relationship. The other relationship is that employees can work as painters on a job. So in this case, we have to have an associative entity because it is a many-to-many relationship. Each job can have lots of painters. Each employee can work on lots of jobs as a painter. So it's a many-to-many relationship. It's an associative entity. And in this case, many of you did this. The job has to have at least one painter, but might have a bunch. Employees might paint on no jobs or might paint on a lot of jobs. So it's an optional many for the associative entity for the painters. Okay, so this one's interesting because you have a situation where you've got a table that's basically referring to itself. That's kind of funky. We haven't seen that before. And we've got a situation where job interacts with employees in two ways. It interacts in a one-to-many relationship and it interacts in a many-to-many relationship. So you have to break those two things out. The many-to-many relationship, where we're trying to do this, right, trying to point towards both of them, becomes an associative entity. The one-to-many relationship, it's just a one-to-many relationship. And the information is stored in a new column on the many side and refers to the information on the one side. Does that make sense? This is where you nod your heads, and then when I ask the follow-up question, if I ask something like this again, could you figure it out? You go, yeah, I don't know, maybe not, right? The first time you see this, it's really confusing. So we're going to try to see more examples of this, certainly as we move through the semester. But this one has some interesting stuff going on as far as those multiple relationships, and especially that unitary relationship where it's with its own table is a little bit different. We haven't seen that before, for sure. Questions for me? You guys know that I can see some of you, and so if you're on your phones, could you quit it? That's really annoying. Let's pay attention to what's going on in class for an hour. I appreciate it. Any questions on this problem?
Yeah, our group pulled from a previous question that we had gone over.
Okay.
And I think it was modeled a little bit differently.
Okay.
Just if you could tell us.
You want to share that one with me, and I can, or share what you guys did, and I can take a look.
Yeah, it was just on this piece right here. I think we had previously had a scenario where you could have managed by, worked by, and then related to the jobs. Why is this one different?
Well, in this case, what you guys have there is you have a worked, and you're pointing your crow's feet out, and that's actually drawn wrong. Worked should have crow's feet pointing in towards worked, and worked should have a square around it. So this drawing is incorrect. This should have this, and the crow's feet should be going this direction.
Okay, so it should be a.
And then it's exactly like what I just showed you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. You need an associative entity to allow for this many-to-many relationship. What you guys have is the many-to-many pointing outwards, and we can't model that.
Okay, so if we just had made this an associative entity, that would have still worked.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Really, really close. Just didn't have it. The details in the previous example are correct.
Okay.
Other questions? All right, let's tackle one more then. Let's go ahead and take a look at problem. Yeah, we can do 13. It's not too hard, so I'll give you guys a little bit less time, and we'll come back and talk about it. All right, let's work through this last problem for today. And I'm going to call on Marissa Howell.
Okay, John, can you share your screen?
That'd be great.
Yeah. Here we go again.
I think Marissa just did this magic hand wave, and then the screen.
There was a bug. It was like flying at me.
Okay, so we were thinking you've got a student, you've got an advisor.
John, Marissa's presenting.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
So we have the student is assigned to one advisor, mandatory one advisor, and then we have the advisor is assigned to mandatory one but many students, and so that's like the separate for their assigned advisor. And then for the advisor who potentially registers them, we have the student is registered by optional many advisors because they may not be registered by the advisor that, like they may be registered by their assigned advisor. And then we have the advisor has a mandatory many students that they register that they're not assigned to. And so then we have that they're registered to, for that specific instance, one mandatory course with that registering. And then that course is optionally registered during that one registration period. So, because we read it as like a student and their course, and the advisor that they registered with for that specific course is like that bottom half, if that makes sense. And so that's how we
Let's talk about a couple things. One, I don't know about this. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm saying I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think that it says that an advisor has to have a minimum of one student. So it's possible that in a given semester, an advisor has no assigned students. They're still an advisor and they still help out the registration process, but they have no one that they are the chief advisor for. In the other direction, 100% that a student has to have exactly one advisor. But going this direction, I think it makes more sense to make it optional. But there, again, it might be, hey, if you're an advisor, you've got to be a chief advisor for at least one person. I just don't see that in the problem description, so I'm not sure about that. The second thing is, I might argue that this, again, and I'm not clear about this, but I might argue that a student has to register at least once to be a student, but maybe not. So that one I'm not as clear about. I wouldn't change that if I were you, but again, there might be some fuzziness there. So if there's some other groups that did this as mandatory, that would make sense to me. I'd be okay with that. Definitely on the other side, you want it to be optional because there are situations where advisors will not help with the registration process. So that's absolutely fine. But on this side, maybe you'd argue for mandatory, maybe not.
Okay.
Let's doubt it. That's questionable. This part, is it inside the scope of this problem? I'm going to argue that it's not, beyond the fact that also I think this is done incorrectly, because wouldn't the course relationship with registration be a many-to-many relationship where there could be many registrations for each course and each course be part of many registrations? So you'd have to have an associative entity in there with who registered for each course, and you'd have to keep going above and beyond that. But if you look at the problem description, I don't see the word course ever. And in fact, what this database is trying to model isn't registration. It's trying to model who is being advised by whom, when, who helped you get registered in classes this semester. So this is a database basically for the advising office. They don't care what classes registered. They just want to know that you met with Professor Boone and he helped you register for classes in spring 2021. And that's why you're taking all these weird electives, right? So that's all they care about. So I think that the course actually is outside the scope and you can just leave it out. So I'm kind of glad you guys did it because it does bring up that point that we want to make sure that our database only models things that are in the scope of what we're trying to solve. And in this case, I don't know that courses actually matter. Now, is there another database someplace else at the university that has students and what they're registered in a given semester? Yeah, of course, it's the registrar's office. Is it tapping into the same database behind the scenes with all of the data about all of our employees, all of our students, all of our courses, all of our teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, probably. But in terms of this model, what we're trying to accomplish with this problem description, that's a separate thing and we don't worry about it.
Ted, I've got a question for you, and it's relatively small, but our group also thought that we need to have kind of just an attribute for year and semester coming off of the associative entity, just to keep that last sentence basically in there, but I wanted to see how to go about that.
Right, so in this particular problem, the way I would think about it from like how the data would be stored, and it would then include that additional attribute, would be something like this. Yeah, and these are stripped down examples. I like to think about how the data would look in addition to the diagram. This helps me kind of make sure that I'm thinking about things correctly. So we'd have a table that has just our advisors, and of course they'd have unique identifiers, and then they'd have all kinds of other stuff about them. But that other stuff doesn't matter from a modeling perspective. We'd have a student table that had all kinds of information about students, but it would have a unique identifier for the student, something like your UIN. And for this problem, the column that I want to make sure that I think about is who is their chief advisor. Every student has to have exactly one chief advisor, and it has to be one of these, in this case, 3 advisors that I have stored. So you have to be working with either A, B, or C. That's one of the things we have to have modeled. And then for the associative entity, the associative entity is where we're trying to get that many-to-many turned around. And in this case, each student would meet with one of the advisors that's available. It might be their assigned advisor, it might not. Problem says it doesn't matter. For a given semester. So the combination of these 3 things, the student ID, the advisor ID, and the semester is unique. Would I then have that same student potentially meet with a different advisor in fall 2021? You bet, right? What's unique is the combination of these three things. So as long as those three things are unique in this table, it would be telling me, I could go look and say, well, who'd you meet with last semester? Your schedule's all kinds of weird. Oh, you met with Professor Boone, he's a doofus. He assigned you all the wrong classes, right? So that's what this table would allow me to do, is the unique combination of those three things. You're right, there's an additional attribute, which you could draw in the picture, of course, which is semester. Other questions, comments, concerns? It feels like, as a general rule, people are getting the basics. I know that some of the problems today were a little bit more challenging, but generally speaking, I was ducking my head into a couple of the groups and it seems like people are starting to get the hang of it. If that is not the case, please reach out to me via email, schedule a meeting with me. We can talk a little bit more about it, but hopefully people are feeling a little bit more comfortable with this stuff. We did not finish all of the problems in this first section of the workbook. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't work through them as individuals, or feel free to catch up with some of your other teammates from some of your group work and work through them. That's fine. We're going to move on starting next week. So on Tuesday, we're going to move on to the third set of lecture notes, where we're going to discuss another chapter in modeling, how we actually move on to the next step. So next Tuesday, I'll be spewing words at you and working through the PowerPoint slides. Definitely be here because we move on to another pretty challenging set of concepts. Okay. Thank you guys all for being here. I'm going to stop the recording, then I'll hang out if there are any last minute questions.